first session tonight in collaboration with LawSoc. I'd like to call on our first registrar, Olivia Tranquich, to read the minutes of last week's private business meeting. Here, here.
Dia Yves, is Misha Olivia agus is Gwen Gourmet? No, I'm not the blonde boy shouting at you at the start of every debate. Usually your registrar Fionn is up here saying things of notable importance, and he told me to do the same. So this morning a pigeon walked onto the Lewis at the Trinity stop and got off at Dawson. Okay. Remarkable stuff is happening all around us, and we thank you deeply for spending your Thursday evening with us. Welcome. Last week, this House decided not to go nuclear. Thankfully, it was not an explosive debate, but it did make me think about how everything in the universe is interconnected. Each atom, including every single atom in our body, is entangled with and has interacted with billions of other atoms dispersed throughout the galaxy. The intense power, danger, energy, and hope of splitting an atom took me back to my own conception in which I was atomized. And here I am, here we all are, billions of atoms connected to each other. Speaking of connection, we just finished up our five-a-side Movember fundraiser. I've never seen this many emotional, raw, sweaty, bloody, passionate men around the G&B before. Well, of course, since the Robbie Lyle Honorary Patronage on Tuesday, where the Udoma subcommittee welcomed the founder of AFTV, prominent broadcaster, entrepreneur, and activist. I've never seen so many men before colouring the world with a bright red Arsenal jerseys. And I know this as one of 4 women amongst a sea of 200 men who attended. On Wednesday, Mary O'Shea, the Dublin-based barrister who has fought for abortion reform in Ireland, received an honorary patronage from the Eliz. And if you missed either of these events, not to worry, the digital age is upon us. Both events were immortalised in a camcorder and will soon be shared on the streaming platform YouTube. Okay, so last weekend, Phil novices went to Oxford. James and Hugh broke novice at the Oxford IV, and Emma judged the final of Oxford Women and Gender Minorities. A huge ups to them and everyone on Team Debates convener. This week was our final week of the beginners debating competition, maidens, and next week on Tuesday and Wednesday will be the semi-finals. On Thursday we will have Wild Card, which is an all-day competition to qualify for the maidens final with only comedy motions as well as free drink and food. And I've been asked to mention it's not only biscuits and tea being offered, but solid foods as well. And speaking of solid food, if we get 50 more sign-ups for Deliveroo, the Phil will provide pizza at the next debate. Please sign up. That'll be my breakfast, lunch and dinner for next Thursday. And tomorrow, Friday, is the last day to speak in a maidens round, so please do turn up. Next Thursday, we have Daniel Sloss, a Scottish stand-up comedian, writer and actor, receiving an honorary patronage at 2 p.m. And next Thursday is our annual All-Ireland debate. Debaters from Queen's University, Belfast, UCD, NUI Galway, the military cadets, and even our brother upstairs, the HIST, will be debating the motion, "This House believes there's nothing worth dying for." So this concludes the private business. Enjoy the debate.
To order and call on our registrar, Fionn Graham, to read the minutes from last week's public business meeting. Here, here.
Before we begin, we'd like to say Quarticus more to the Movember five-a-side footballers who showed up just before this debate tonight. It was a fantastic turnout on 8th of November, and the winning team included the players James Prendergast, Anthony Adewui, Ollie Purser, Harvey O'Callaghan, Tony Cost, Fionn Graham, August, Rory Bates. So, Bulabus, over in the good tree. Now, folks, Fulcha, talk to a very exciting and more serious debate this evening. It's a pleasure to have you guys joining us in this collaboration with the Trinity Law Society and the Phil. Trinona in you, to on Chak Teresh Vulla, a hort that this House prefers a world without prisons, and that word inside is very important. Without. In a different debate, we might have heard arguments for, adjustments of prison policy, better educational programs, different sentencing and improved mental health facilities. But this isn't quite that debate. The burden on the proposition here tonight is much higher than that. If they wish to argue for an end of prisons by presenting an alternative option, they will have to convincingly show that option to be entirely different from our current understanding of prisons, for they are asking for a world entirely without which what we currently have. See, this is why I normally print. The arguments on either side of the House may appear to come from two separate intuitions, personal intuitions. The proposition will likely have concerns of compassion and empathy for the people that our society has wished to hide away. They may have a hopeful, optimistic view on man's ability to change and to return to society anew. The opposition's arguments may come from a place of pragmatism for concern for the safety of law-abiding people in communities, especially those riddled with violence and drugs. A key pillar in both these sides may stand or fall based on a personal intuition or opinion of yours, one that may already be formed before this debate tonight. Can every person improve and be welcome members of society again? Or do some people, at some point in their lives, go beyond all hope? It seems against many of our intuitions that some be condemned completely. Deep in the Christian roots of much of European morality lies the idea that all sin is forgivable, except for one, the blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. Now, historically, that understanding would have meant turning deep within yourself fully against morality itself. That is the only thing that you can't be forgiven for. However, even before religion began to decline, the majority of Christian societies continued to practice capital punishment until the mid-20th century. Even certain states in America continue to do so. The majority of Europe also currently, bar Iceland and Norway, still include a life sentence within their justice system. If all things are eventually forgivable, it seems we've decided that that forgiveness is the duty of a higher power and not one in our hands. Last year, this philosophical society welcomed, and was very fortunate enough to welcome, Thomas Reichenthal, a victim of crimes against humanity. He was a childhood Jewish survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He was kept first in Bergen-Belsen camp and then in Buchenwald concentration camp. He described to all of us as we sat here in this chamber how he and the other children would play hide and seek amongst piles of bodies. When his interview finished, someone put up their hand, it was kind of what we were all wondering, and asked the question, how do you find it in yourself to forgive the people that did this? His answer was, I don't have the right to forgive them. I'm still alive. Forgiveness can only come from every single one of those that died. Who has the right to forgive so completely? But who has the right to detain? These will be the ideas and many more discussed tonight in this very exciting motion. On the proposition, on the side of the House proposing that it prefers a world without prisons, August Ector stock in Diasport, we have the Uchtron at the head of the Trinity Women-in-Law, Molly Mullen-Haslam. Teresh, in charge of the Phil's videography, YouTube videos, and reels, we have our very own Philosophical Society author, Aaliyah Mullen. Agduna Aaron Tate proposition, we have an author, playwright, and revolutionary. He is most known for his memoirs describing his experience as a provisional Irish Republican Army prisoner and his experience partaking in the 1981 hunger strike in the Maze prison. He and his fellow prisoners demanded the status of political prisoners. His hunger strike personally lasted 70 days. Tá Tálinn go bhfuil sé ag caint a nocht, Máiste do Thuile, thug fóilte mór Riv Lawrence McKeown. Aaron Vela. Ag Uskal the High in Opposition, we have all the way from Australia, we have a seasoned debater, student of law, English and philosophy, Tom Carn. Ag Lannan to Kaitora Shin, we have a past debater from Glasgow University Union. She is now doing a master's with Trinity College and UCD in the study of comparative social change. Bula Bus Lahai and Anya Vikaskin. Vikaskin, sorry. Agduna, Dunrasura, August and Diasport there fought. We have final year law student, past chair of the Trinity Law Colloquium, and now order of the Trinity Law Society. Let hug Fólse Us Ord Zoya Karani. folks, we could not have asked for a better group to tackle this question here tonight. Lishin, Tó Gachard Reg. As always, the speakers, gan Irian Tolif, August, Lick from Midden Diaspora to Tussiu. Gur Mila, thank you very much.
Gentlemen, welcome to the University Philosophical Society. The motion that stands before the House tonight is this House prefers a world without prisons in collaboration with LawSoc. Standing orders are as follows. Speeches are 7 minutes long and 10 minutes for our guest speakers. At the first and last minute of every speech, which will be signified by a bell, speakers and audience members are welcome to offer points of information. We prioritise and encourage participation in all of our debates, so if you hear something you like, you can shout hear here, and if you hear something you disagree with, you can shout shame. We prioritise dignity and respect at all our debates. Therefore, if you hear something tonight that you take issue with, our senior member of council, Russell Bolger, is in the corner of the room there and will be available all night, or is contactable at smc@tcdphil.com. Alternatively, I am contactable at president@tcdphil.com. With that said, we're going to begin the debate. Aaron Collin and Molly Haslam to open the case for the proposition. Hear, hear.
Members of the House, today I rise for the proposition who stands firmly behind a simple but transformative idea. We would prefer a world without prisons. Not because we deny harm, not because we ignore victims, and not because we seek to excuse wrongdoing, but because the prison system as it exists and as it has always existed fails at every purpose it claims to serve. A world without prisons is not only possible, but morally required. And I say that because once you strip away the concrete, the steel bars and the uniformed officers, prisons stand revealed for what they really are, institutions of harm disguised as instruments of justice. Firstly, we need to address the root causes of crime, poverty and social inequality. Crime is often framed as individual moral failure, as though people choose to offend in isolation. But the reality is far more complex. To create a just society, we need to get to the bottom of why people enter the criminal justice system in the first place. Most people in prisons are not hardened criminals, but victims of social and economic disadvantage. Poverty, unemployment, trauma, unstable family environments, lack of education, and mental health issues drive the overwhelming majority of offending. Prisons do nothing to address these issues. They simply punish the symptoms, often making them worse. If we want to reduce crime and simply abolish the prison system, we must focus on prevention and social investment, adequate housing, healthcare and mental health services, education, training and employment opportunities, community-based interventions addressing trauma, addiction and marginalisation. Evidence shows that investing in these areas works. Countries like Norway and the Netherlands, which prioritise prevention over incarceration, have far lower reoffending rates and safer societies than those that rely on prisons. Abolishing prisons forces us to confront the real causes of crime rather than hiding them behind bars. My second point is that prisons do not make us safer, they perpetuate harm. The opposition may claim that prisons keep dangerous people off the streets, but the truth is the opposite. Prisons take people who are often traumatized, impulsive, or mentally unwell and place them in environments that increase violence, addiction, instability, and psychological damage. Then they release those people back into society, often more likely to offend than before. Deterrence is equally illusory. You cannot deter someone who does not believe they have a future. Prisons treat the symptom, not the disease, and until we confront the disease, the cycle of crime, harm, and incarceration will continue. My third point is that the prison system violates human dignity. Even if the opposition argues prisons are necessary, the practical reality is that they fail the most basic human rights standards. In Ireland, for example, overcrowding is chronic. Many prisons regularly operate above official capacity, forcing prisoners into cramped, unsafe conditions. Mental health support is severely limited. According to the Irish Prison Service Inspectorate, up to 60% of prisoners report mental health problems, yet resources are insufficient. Access to education, training, and rehabilitation is patchy. Prisoners often leave more isolated, unskilled, and disadvantaged than when they arrived. Vulnerable populations such as young offenders, women, people with addiction issues face disproportionate harm and neglect. These are not minor flaws. They are systemic violations of basic human rights, including the right to humane treatment and dignity. Prisons are not merely ineffective, they are morally and legally indefensible institutions in practice. They harm individuals, families, and communities while pretending to serve justice. So, in conclusion, abolishing prisons does not mean abandoning justice. On the contrary, it forces society to confront the real causes of crime and adopt solutions that prevent harm before it happens. Ideas such as community rehabilitation and restorative justice, where offenders face the consequences of their actions directly with victims, repairing relationships and understanding harm. Investments in housing, mental health, education, and employment to tackle the social conditions that drive offending. Secure therapeutic facilities for the small minority who pose serious danger, designed to rehabilitate rather than punish. This is evidence-based, moral, and effective. Prisons offer none of this. They destroy autonomy, dignity, and social bonds while pretending to provide justice. This debate is not whether harm exists. It's about how societies respond to harm, with more harm or with solutions that actually work. Prisons violate dignity. They fail victims, they create danger, they do not deter, they do not rehabilitate, and they are not necessary. What is necessary is courage, the courage to imagine justice not as vengeance, but as prevention and restoration. For all these reasons, the proposition and I proudly stands in favour of the motion, and I urge you to do the same. This House would live in a world with no prisons. Thank you.
For a very fine speech in Colin Cloncaird. Open the side for opposition. Here.
It is such a privilege to open the opposition's case and to have the chance to respond to those admittedly very compelling arguments made by Molly at first proposition. I'd like to start off by asking everybody to please close your eyes for me. Now, let's imagine together. Imagine the world that the proposition has painted for us. Education can prevent even the most psychopathic criminals from offending. Prevention is a catch-all and universal success tool, and addressing social inequalities erases criminal activity. Now, open your eyes. We are back in the real world. No prisons mean more crime. Actions should have consequences. You do the crime, you serve the time. If you hadn't realised this already, I'm Australian, so it means a lot for me to be standing on this side of the house, because my country was once literally a penal colony. Indeed, I am even the descendant of convicts that were sent down under to serve their time. Without those prisons and without Australia, it's hard to see where adventurous Irish people in their mid-20s would flock to. I digress. The operative word in this topic is that this House would prefer a world without prisons. This is a debate about preference, rather than the state of prisons, as the proposition have insisted. That means that we can comfortably concede that the prison system is not perfect, and I'm not up here to suggest that it is. But instead, our burden is to address the problems that Molly has identified and say that even with these problems, warts and all, we would prefer a world with prisons to one without. There are undoubtedly prison systems that are inhumane, both currently and historically, don't contribute to rehabilitation, and the world would be better off without. But this is not the debate. The debate is whether a world with prisons is preferable. The existence of bad prisons, we submit, is not reason enough to prefer a world without them. With this framework in place, I argue that we win this debate through both the principled and the practical framings of the argument. The practical argument looks to the future. I will argue the means of imprisoning a person is justified insofar as it achieves the ends of deterring future crimes and protecting society at large. The principled argument looks to the past. If a criminal goes to prison, they are getting their just desserts. Actions have consequences, and if you do the crime, you serve the time. I will start with why we should prefer a world with prisons for the practical benefits they offer. A world without prisons is a world without deterrence. We prefer deterrence. The argument was raised at first proposition that deterrence does not occur through the prison system, but I would argue that the recidivism rate of prison repeat offenders, being at around 28%, is actually suggestive that prisons do offer a specific deterrent model for prisoners to understand that their actions have consequences and they don't want those consequences repeated. I will argue for a consequentialist view of punishment, that proportionate punishment is sometimes appropriate where it leads to advantageous consequences. I wish we lived in a world where everyone was so governed by moral codes that conscience were reason enough to not commit crimes. But, as we all know from the criminal prices of eating out in Dublin, this is not the case. People will commit crimes if not offered a significant disincentive to do so. The problem is this: law is necessary for social order, and people will only follow laws if they know that breaking the law comes with consequences, sometimes in the form of prison time. This is the reason that people are willing to take the risk of potentially not tapping on their leap card when they know that it only results in a minor fine. But let's say if the same breaking of the law resulted in a 5-year prison sentence, less people would be incentivized to do so. It's a simple equation. A bigger punishment results in less offending. Punishment in the form of prison time is therefore appropriate. Not only does it deter the specific prisoner from reoffending, but it also deters the general public because they know and see what happens to people that commit serious crimes. Even if we accept that the proposition model does introduce some form of deterrent features in the form of community rehabilitation, we submit that compared to prisons, this sort of rehabilitative feature as a deterrent lacks immediacy, lacks comparable severity, and ultimately is a lackadaisical approach to addressing serious crimes which exist in society, irrespective of addressing social conditions. Turning your minds now to my second practical point, which is this: a world without prisons is a world without protection. We prefer protection. Removing and isolating dangerous criminals from society actually does protect us from the dangers those criminals pose. And not only does it do this, but it also engenders public confidence in social safety, at least for the duration of their isolation. A community rehabilitative model does not do this because prisoners are still integrated into society, and therefore public confidence in social safety is diminished. I argue this point is a self-evident truth. Society is safer when dangerous people are taken out of it. So I will now move to the principled argument for preferring a world with prisons. A world without prisons is a world without retribution. We prefer retribution. And importantly, retribution does not need to be this brutal or inhumane phenomenon. It can just follow the principle that wrongdoers owe a debt to society due to the harm that they cause. I'm sure many of us were told to go to our room as a child when we insulted our parents' cooking, even if it were 2-minute noodles for the 3rd time that week. Or I'm sure that many of us have even told our dogs to go outside if they defecate on our favourite carpet. If you do something bad, you accept the bad consequences of what you have done. This is something that we are taught from birth. Adulthood should be no different. Ultimately, Molly and the proposition have offered some very compelling arguments throughout this debate. But I argue that the suggestion of a viable alternative to prisons is ultimately idealised and impractical. Audience, I urge you, side with a world of prisons and protection, side with the opposition, and that is why I'm so very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Contestant to continue the case for the opposition. Hear, hear.
Oh my God.
Sorry. Thank you very much for having me. This is super exciting. I want to tell you the story of Jacob Dunn. I had the immense privilege of watching this play called Punch that tells his real life story. When he was very young, he got very drunk and he punched a man when he was on a night out in Nottingham. That one punch killed this man. He was in the hospital for 9 days. His parents didn't know if he was going to make it, and he didn't. Jacob was then sentenced for 13 months, was sentenced for a period of 13 months. He went to jail, he did the 13 months, and when he came out, someone reached out to him and they said that they wanted him to participate in a restorative justice program with the parents of the boy who died. And this was a great success story, right? Because the parents asked Jacob who he was, why he did what he did, and Jacob was astonished that someone he'd taken so much away from would even want to engage with him in that way. And now they're doing great. They're huge advocates for the restorative justice program. I know you're thinking that I prepped the wrong side of this motion, but I tell you this story because government is not entirely wrong. There is value in alternative justice mechanisms. It gives a lot of meaning for people who have perpetrated violent crime and the victims and the families and communities of those violent crimes. But in one of the interview, Joan, the mother, says that when she was in court, when Jacob was being sentenced, and when the judge said that he'd got only 13 months, she felt betrayed. She felt that 13 months wasn't long enough, that it wasn't enough punishment for her losing her son, for the more than 13 years that she would never get to spend with him, never get to see him ever again. And when asked if at that point she would choose to engage in a restorative justice program, she said no. It takes time to heal when you have experienced violent crime. Government wants to put victims of crime as well as perpetrators in an equal position where they're able to share their values and really heal from this. But healing doesn't happen overnight. It can't happen in the immediate aftermath of that crime. It takes a journey for you to go through. But what happens in the interim? What is justice in that interim? It has to be retributive. And that is why the eye for an eye mechanism that we give you in opposition works. This is why we need prisons. Because we can agree with side government that prisons are flawed, as is any justice mechanism that any side of this house can come up with, because humanity is flawed. We are part of the systems that we create. We are the ones that create it. So if we are flawed by ourselves, then the systems that we create have to be flawed. Consider communal rehabilitation. That doesn't always work. Communal rehab also has reoffense happening all the time. Drug rehabilitation doesn't always work. People use again after going through rehabilitation. There are a myriad of problems that exist with restorative justice models. The second speaker for the proposition talks about how, if you're a rich person, you can just bribe a judge, or the prison system means something completely different to you. But those same biases exist in alternative sentencing and alternative justice forms as well. What if you are a victim of abuse or assault or murder because your family member went there, and the perpetrator is a rich, white, posh man with a cool accent that you can't compete with if you're a person of color who doesn't have that cool accent, who comes from an impoverished background. You're engaging with each other in an unequal power setting. How can government guarantee that restorative justice models aren't going to be coercive for these people, aren't going to re-traumatize them, no matter how many safeguards you put in their way? All of these systems are deeply flawed. But the good news is that this isn't a zero-sum game. Both of these systems can exist. You can have multiple ways for victims and perpetrators to access justice, rehabilitation, and reform. Because that is the burden on side government today. the complete abolition of the prison system, a world where they do not exist at all. And I don't think they have met the burden so far. I want you to think about if you have like mold in your apartment, right? When you have mold in your apartment, you tend to get a lot of colds, right? You get a lot of flu. But you take paracetamol and you ensure that the mold goes away, right? You just don't keep taking the paracetamol and keep living in the same moldy apartment, but you also just don't like completely abandon ship and move to a different house. This means, the point of that is that structural problems can be recognized and can be solved, but you also have to, treat the symptoms of these problems. The social investment programs that government talks about are super duper important, but they also take a very long time for their benefits to actually materialize. You can't solve the housing crisis in a day. You can't solve wealth inequality in a day. You can't solve racism in a day. You can't solve all of the problems that they talk about, the policing of bodies of color, the violence that women face on streets and homes every day. You can't solve these problems in a day. So what do you do in the interim? You protect the people by sending these dangerous individuals to prison, while also making sure that you have alternative forms of rehabilitation and restoration that are happening. I think I lack the imagination on side government, and I will bite this bullet. I am not nearly creative or imaginative enough to look at a world where all of these problems can be solved quickly, easily, and without any flaws. If this world exists, I would be very happy to side with government, but insofar as they haven't told me, and I think you as well, what that world looks like, there is no option but to side with opposition. Thank you.
Speaker for that very fine speech, and Colin Rhodes McEwen to close the debate for the proposition. Hear, hear.
Ladies and gentlemen, adjudicators and fellow debaters, I stand firmly in support of the motion that this House prefers a world without prisons. I suppose to some ears, to imagine a world without prisons sounds like an ultra-leftist, utopian, preposterous idea. What would we do with all these dangerous criminals roaming free? We've heard some of that from the opposite bench here. Anarchy would reign, the public would be unsafe, society would disintegrate. I profoundly disagree. The deprivation of liberty within most advanced democratic states remains the ultimate punishment for breaches of the criminal code. The assumption is that imprisonment incapacitates the offender while deterring others. Incapacitation and deterrence, retribution and denunciation remain the key moral and political justifications for it. In principle, calibrated as time confiscated from the offender, proportionate to the seriousness of the offence committed. All of this cloaked in the language of rehabilitation. Therein lies the profound deceit. The illusion that prison regimes have the intent, capacity and personnel to transform those who enter them into contrite, reconstituted individuals before they depart. That is both an illusion and an absurdity. Prisons do not deter crime. They do not rehabilitate, and they do not build safer communities. What they do is reinforce social inequality and cause deep, lasting harm. I wish to make 3 points. Prisons are ineffective and counterproductive. Prisons are socially and morally damaging, disproportionately impact on marginalised communities, and most importantly, proven alternatives to imprisonment exist that do produce better outcomes. Prisons are ineffective and counterproductive. In Ireland, reoffending rates in general are persistently high, and the rate is even higher for those sentenced to less than 12 months. Recidivism stands at around 60% for some categories of offences. Why? Because prisons are environments where people learn survival and violence, not change. Imagine if you were talking about a hospital rather than a prison. If for every 10 patients it treated, 6 returned within a year with the same ailment, there would be public demands for an inquiry. Yet these are the statistics for recidivism. So why do we continue to imprison people, especially when there is an alternative? We do so because the idea of imprisonment is so embedded in our consciousness that a society without captives is unimaginable. Let's move beyond prisons per se and look at other institutions that have operated here in Ireland. And look at which we now hang our heads in shame. The workhouses, the sanatoria, the mother and baby homes, the Magdalene laundries. Women had to be taken out of society as they were either bad or mad or both. They had to be punished, and not just the removal of their liberty, but a life of hardship imposed upon them so as to atone for their moral crimes. I repeat, the idea of imprisonment, of the removal of some people from our society, and punishment and retribution, rather than rehabilitation, is deeply embedded in our consciousness. It's also much more than that, of course. Incarceration reflects political, regulatory responses to offending behaviours within hierarchical societies. Societies divided by wealth and poverty, gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity. We can also add that imprisonment is used to suppress civil and political dissent, as we see today in Israel-Palestine and closer to home not so long ago in the north of our country. The rule of law, the administration of the criminal justice system, does not operate outside society's structural inequalities, but instead reflects their determining context. The second point, prisons are socially and morally damaging. As actor and playwright Emmett Kirwan so eloquently put it on the Late Late Show, it wasn't the people in the tracksuits who bankrupted this country and caused untold misery. It was the people in business suits. White-collar crime costs Ireland millions each year, but because those involved in such crimes have the money to engage expensive lawyers, there are no white-collar criminals in prison. In contrast, people from deprived backgrounds are hugely overrepresented in the prisons. This is not because those communities necessarily commit more crime. It is because they're more heavily policed, have fewer resources for strong legal defence, and more vulnerable to criminalisation of poverty-related behaviour. And what of those imprisoned? In Ireland, we have seen rising levels of self-harm, suicide attempts, and mental health crises. Isolation, overcrowding, drugs and violence create conditions that worsen mental illness. These are not environments for rehabilitation. They are places of accumulated trauma. They are holding centres for people struggling with homelessness, addiction, and mental health problems. People incarcerated for offences directly linked to poverty, such as a non-payment of fines, petty shoplifting, and breaches of probation conditions. Society fails people and then punishes them for the results of that failure. Thirdly, effective alternatives. The critical argument for the abolition of prisons is the fact that alternatives do work, and we have evidence that they work. Restorative justice, for example, we still show that even when used in limited ways, it has been overwhelmingly positive: lower reoffending, higher victim satisfaction, and real accountability. Community sentences. There's overwhelming evidence again that community sentences reduce reoffending far more effectively than prisons, and yet in Ireland, almost 80% of people, 80%, sent to prison are for minor offences receiving sentences of less than 12 months. Community sentences, addiction treatment, education programmes, electronic monitoring, and structured support deliver far better outcomes than prison. They allow people to remain in jobs, maintain family relationships, and access services, the things that actually do reduce crime. But what do those individuals I hear you say, and we've heard it from the opposition bench, who pose a genuine risk of serious harm to others? Yet again, it has been proven that placing such individuals in therapeutic and health-based secure environments is far more effective than punitive prisons. Places designed for treatment and risk management, not punishment. Let us remind ourselves that the safest countries in Europe are not the ones with the largest prison systems, but the ones with the strongest social foundations. Early intervention, youth work, housing support, and mental health services reduce crime dramatically more than any prison ever has. And of course, these services and resources cost money. But when we consider that it costs just under €100,000 per year to keep one person in prison, I repeat, it costs just under €100,000 per year to keep one person in prison. Surely that money could be much better spent in investing in social, health, and educational services. Any radical change to contemporary social practices first begins with the ability to imagine. And I've heard the previous speaker talking about imagining and lack of imagination. I'm glad to hear that. To imagine the new and challenge the old. In this instance, to imagine a world without prisons. Just as at one point in history, someone dared to imagine that one day universal suffrage would become a reality. That women as well as men could vote, that women could become members of parliament, could even one day become prime minister. That a black man could become the president of the United States, or a woman become president of Ireland. We still have to imagine a woman as a Taoiseach, but that's another. Or more recently, that women would have the right to choose and that gay people could marry. Imaginings that were at one time not only regarded as preposterous, but as extremely dangerous to the moral fabric of society. It all began with a willingness to imagine a new society, new social relations, a new way of doing things. Ireland can build a justice system based on compassion and caring, on humanity and genuine public safety. Because prisons do not make society safer. They never have. Alternatives do. In conclusion, as I stand here tonight in this hollow building, I'm reminded of one of Trinity's most celebrated alumni, Oscar Wilde, sent to prison because of his sexual orientation. Oscar wrote about his experiences there. He firmly believed the system itself was the problem, not the individual prisoners. He wrote, "It is not the prisoners who need reformation, it is the prisons." You might say, well, but that was the 19th century, things are so much different today. But are they really? Just take a look at who is in prison and why, and tell me that we, in the 21st century, cannot do things much better. I urge you to support this motion.
Speech and call Zoe Karani to close the debate for the opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, that's going to slip down. You're right, that's why we print. Hi everyone, my name is Zoe Karani and I'm the auditor of LawSoc. Being the last speaker here tonight after all the arguments and deliberation from both sides, it's a slightly cursed position to be in. We've heard a lot of great points, a lot of worthy moral anger, and I'll be honest, when I started researching for this motion, I struggled, mostly because I was feeling the after effects of Springball, but also because it's a highly contentious topic. But then I remembered I'm a law student, and fortunately I have an ego almost as big as the Phil Council, so I realized, love you guys, so I realized I can argue almost anything. Most importantly, I could try to bring this debate back to reality. Today, the proposition asks you to imagine a world without prisons. It sounds compassionate. It sounds progressive. But when you scratch beneath the surface, you discover a world that is not safer, not fairer, and certainly not more humane. In fact, a world without prisons risks abandoning the very people who need the law's protection the most. You heard again and again that prisons don't work, that they perpetuate cycles of crime, that rehabilitation must replace incarceration. Let me be clear. I agree that many of the prisons today are failing. I agree that far too often they're brutal, overcrowded, and underfunded. But if your hospital is underfunded and people are dying in corridors, you don't abolish hospitals. If your school system is unequal and people are dying and failing disadvantaged pupils, you don't abolish schools. If an institution is necessary for public safety, you reform it. You don't pretend that society can function without it. Most of the arguments for abolition we've heard tonight are not actually about a free prison world. They're about transforming the one we have. On that, I can happily agree. Prisons must change. Where I fundamentally disagree is the leap from the system is broken to the system must not exist. Abolition sounds principled, but it deliberately ignores the realities of human behavior. There are people who are violent, predatory, dangerous, repeat offenders. There are people who commit crimes so serious that removing them from society is not an act of cruelty, but an act of protection. The most fundamental duty of a state is to protect its citizens. A world with no safe place to separate violent offenders from the public is a world that abandons that duty. You cannot rehabilitate someone while they're actively harming others. Removing them from society is what gives space for rehabilitation even to begin. We're also told that once prisons are gone, rehabilitation somehow will blossom freely. But look at the real-world examples that even the proposition also mentioned. The countries with the most successful rehabilitation systems, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, they have prisons. They're radically humane and focused on reform. They remain places of secure confinement. If we care about the evidence and not just perception, we should pay attention to what actually works. Norway's recidivism rate is under 20%. United States, with its huge punitive system, has over 70%. The conclusion here is not to get rid of prisons, but fix prisons. Because when you strip away the rhetoric, the grand alternative of rehabilitation and restorative justice isn't a world without prisons at all. It is a prison, just done properly. A lot of abolitionist rhetoric focuses on marginalization, the claim that prisons are just warehouses for the impoverished and racial minorities. The idea that global capitalism and deindustrialization create poverty, poverty creates crime, and prison is simply how the system cages its surplus people. There's a grain of truth and a bucket of nonsense in this. Yes, poverty correlates with higher crime rates, but correlation is not causation. People living in poverty do not commit violent crimes or harmful crimes. They do not abuse their partners, run drug networks, or commit sexual assault because of capitalism. To imply otherwise is deeply patronizing. It suggests that disadvantaged people are somehow destined for criminality, which is simply untrue. Abolishing prisons does not fix lack of housing, unemployment, poor education, or marginalization. It simply removes society's ability to protect vulnerable people while those larger issues are being solved. In fact, if you abolish prisons in an unequal society, you don't end oppression, you increase it. And that is because the burden of the risk falls hardest on the same disadvantaged communities who already face the most violence. Even in societies with strong welfare states, strong unions, and low inequality, prisons still exist. Why? Because some harms are not economic in origin, they're interpersonal, violent, or rooted in human behavior, not economic structure. This argument that inequality exists, therefore prisons are illegitimate, muddles two different moral problems. And yes, they are problems. You can and you should fight against inequality, invest in welfare, and support struggling communities, but none of that removes the need for safe, accountable way to respond to violent or dangerous behavior. The correct solution is to fix the legal system, not to remove an institution capable of holding violent offenders accountable. Lastly, victims deserve justice, not vengeance, but justice. Imagine telling the mother of a murdered child that the perpetrator will not be imprisoned, but instead offered reintegration therapy. Imagine telling the victims of violent, invasive crimes that their assailant will stay within the community under supervised support. A world without prison shifts the emotional and physical burden back onto victims and communities, demanding that they coexist with those who inflicted profound harm. That is not justice. That is cruelty disguised as compassion. Now, before I end, let me ask you something human, not just legal, just as people. When you read about a particularly gruesome crime where a young woman is murdered or an infant is killed, is your first thought, I hope that assailant gets help that they need? No, you want them to face the consequences for their action and go to prison. And that is not a monstrous instinct. That is basic moral intuition. That some harms are so great that they demand serious structured response. If you want prisons to transform from their inhumane conditions, if you want shorter sentences for minor offenses, if you want mental health courts, drug diversion schemes, community programs, that is a different conversation. And I will agree with you there. But you still need prisons for the people who remain dangerous, for the people that cause catastrophic harm, and for the people who need structured, secure environments to have even any hope of changing. In all of this noise about systems, structures, statistics, the question at the heart of this motion is actually very simple. When a person is willing to destroy another person's life or negatively impact someone else's life, what duty do we owe everyone else? A world without prisons shrugs off that question. I'm not willing to create that kind of world, and I don't think you are either. So tonight, vote not for no prisons, but for prisons worthy of the word justice. Thank you very much.
Thank our speaker for a very fine speech, and thank all of our speakers for what was an excellent debate. You hear? In a moment, we're going to call this House to a vote. So those in favour of the motion will say aye, and those against the motion will say nay. Before that, I'd just like to say that we'll have afters at Doyle's tonight, and we have oratory returns that will be up on the walls by the bar and in Convo. We encourage you to scan the QR code and rate our speakers out of 10. It helps us make better debates for all of you. With that said, those in favour of the motion say aye. Aye. Those against the motion say nay. Nay. The nays have it.